was a really
That's what
happy scene.
All right, since it's 7 o'clock and we're pretty much all here, I think we can go ahead and call the meeting to order.
Are we all?
And so beginning with roll call. Hi, sorry.
Just the one from the internet, I guess. From the agenda.
Hi, sorry, technical challenges, as always. Committee Member Cooper?
Here.
Committee Member Larson? Here. Committee Member Martin?
Here.
Committee Member Peterson?
Here.
Committee Member Way?
Here.
Chair Smithies?
Here. Great, so beginning with the minutes from our last meeting on May 15th, are there any comments for those?
Sorry, we sent those out a little late this month, but hopefully you got them.
Yeah, I think they were just sent this morning. Any notes on those? They're also printed in front of you, I believe.
Just to, again, I don't know how it's possible. I guess we have to go back and look at recordings to see what people actually said. When people speak, especially the public, there's no way to get a synopsis in the minutes.
So you asked for that last month, so we tried. Lizzie actually spent a lot of time doing it, and we took it out because it's just too difficult in a couple sentences to really do a synopsis of what someone says. Often the items aren't necessarily all that relevant to the agenda item. And so we figured there's really not a way for us to do it in a concise manner.
Fine. And we didn't make any decisions on stuff. I don't think any motion. Oh, there was the one motion, yeah. Okay.
Are there any other comments on these minutes? All right, if not, I move to approve the May 15th minutes.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Great. And so then moving right along to public comment period. So this is a chance to comment on anything that's not on tonight's agenda. If anyone would like to, go ahead and come up to the mic.
Hi, my name is Rachel Sarah. I'm a parent, an Albany parent of a second grader, be in second grade next year at Ocean View, and a recent Albany High grad. I'm also a Safe Routes to Schools champion. I started a green team at Ocean View this year, and I'm also a journalist and a writer. I recently wrote about Albany High turning down a senior's 1-minute speech about reversing climate change, and I'm hoping to meet with the Albany High's vice principal next week to discuss this. And I'm really curious to talk to a couple of Albany High students about this too. And I'm here because I've noticed a disconnect between Albany Unified School District and the Climate Change Action Committee. And I know Claire did so much work in the past to bridge that communication, and I know the city has a lot on his plate. I recently met this week with a lot of the Safe Routes to Schools champions, and we talked about next year with Ocean View construction, encouraging kids to bike and walk to, for example, the middle school annex. My second grader and I are going to be leading a late bird bike train to the middle school annex. And so we're really doing so much at the ground level. We have a whole plan to reduce waste at Ocean View. And so part of this, I really am asking, how can we communicate better with you what's going on at the ground level? How can we make this happen? I'm not sure who the person is, how to do this. We're definitely frustrated because we want to let you know what's going on and just communicate better. So that's our ask, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you.
I can't remember if we can comment on.
So you're not allowed to discuss the item, but it is something you can agendize for a future meeting.
Can we offer a
and-
suggestion? No.
Sure.
Oh, there is a group called the Albany Climate Action Coalition, and you might Google them, and that group is the primary group that's trying to bring about climate action events and things, so please get involved with that.
And Rachel and I can talk offline too if there's a way to connect you further with this group.
Yeah. I'll talk to you. Yeah. Is there anybody else who would like to step up and have any public comments to make? All right. Thank you. And now moving on to announcements, beginning with sustainability events.
So just a list of a few sustainability events this month. Bike About Town is scheduled for this Friday. And on June 22nd, there'll be a Friends of Albany Parks cleanup at the Dartmouth Tot Lot. The Household Hazardous Waste Collection event is also this weekend, June 23rd at Golden Gate Fields. If you are interested, you must register online beforehand, but it's a free collection event. They're taking mattresses, household hazardous waste, it's kind of defined broadly, e-waste included. Stop Waste is holding a workshop on improving indoor air quality, kind of focused on young families, at the Ecology Center on Saturday, June 29th from 2 to 3 p.m. We haven't promoted this widely because the Ecology Center's classroom is quite small and they're almost full. But if you're interested, I can send you a link. But it's kind of an RSVP only thing. And then our annual green, red, white, and blue 4th of July celebration is at Memorial Park on 4th of July, complete with beard contest, diaper derby, and pet show. So clearly very green. So those are the events between now and your next meeting.
Thank you.
I would bring up some events that I participated in. So I went to the Albany Middle School Annex opening, which was very exciting, and I was expecting to go there and really berate them that you need to get the solar in, and lo and behold, the solar is in. So they have the solar system in. It's an all-electric building. I think this is probably the best performing public building in Albany, for sure. So it may even be able to trend towards net zero. So we should all be very, very excited about that. I did get to chat briefly with one of the members of the Albany Unified School District had a building committee that was focused on sustainability. And apparently Nick Pilch had been on that along with a few other members. I didn't catch the name of the gal, but I got her information. I'll contact her about how our committee or others could be more involved with what's coming up with Ocean View and Marin. And then also with the high school and trying to promote more sustainable energy in the district and making district buildings more green. So there's one other thing, but it has completely gone out of my mind right now. But anyway, I was very excited about that. That was very encouraging. So I heard it was on budget and everything too, so it's a great new building. And all the kids from Ocean View are going to be over there. So, hooray.
Great. Great. Anybody else who has something to add to the sustainability events? All right, then moving on to 4.2, EBCE update.
So we had our monthly meeting at Stop Waste yesterday, and EBCE came and gave a presentation sort of updating city staff around the county on their local development business plan implementation. And this slide is particular. I pulled a few slides from their deck to share with you. This slide is particularly exciting to me because it aligns very well with the draft cap measures that are in there right now. So their plans are to invest in building electrification through heat pump, water heater incentives, a REACH code program, as we've shared with you before, and we can talk later on the agenda about green building REACH codes. Workforce and building inspector training and permit standardization, new electrification rate pilot. So the idea is they might actually reduce your electricity rate if you have an all-electric building. So that's really an exciting incentive. And then also electric living showcases, which is going to start with induction heat stove sort of demonstrations at farmers markets, which is something that had come out of our discussions at the CAP in terms of maybe doing those classes at our community center, so we can kind of look to them and see how these pilots are going. So there's a lot of opportunity to partner with them, and it's really exciting to see this come to fruition. We were hoping that something great would come out of this program more than just clean electricity, and it seems like that's really happening fast.
How do they run an electric induction stove? I have to bring a big generator? I mean, that's.
I have no idea. I don't know the logistics at all, and I'm not sure that they figured them out, but I think this is what they're planning to do next fiscal year. So.
It's pretty portable, actually. You can get an electric induction cooktop. Yeah, and you can boil water really fast with it. Yeah. But obviously gas has its fans.
Yeah. A little bit more about their programs. They're also going to focus on demand response, energy. They're going to continue to focus on energy efficiency, but not provide redundant programs. So there are a lot of other programs regionally for energy efficiency, and so they're kind of finding out what their niche is.
Are these annual numbers?
I believe this is next fiscal year's budget. Lizzie, is that what you took from it? And then community investment grants, including government innovation grants, which basically is each city will get a small portion of funding to help us leverage other funds, so help us with grant matches, that kind of thing. There was discussion about maybe using that funding to help pay for Civic Spark Fellows because we've lost our other funding for Civic Spark Fellows. But don't worry, we're going to have one next year. We're in interviews now for a Civic Spark Fellow. So. And they're also looking at procurement and net energy metering programs as well, which are a little bit more on their technical side. So I won't go into too much detail there, but that's kind of the update from them. We didn't get opt-up numbers yesterday. Maybe they've stopped sharing them. I don't know. I know Livermore's don't look so great, but this is the last slide that they shared in terms of their analysis of emissions by sector. And you can tell, in some ways it looks similar to our graphs where transportation is a huge portion of emissions. And so because of that, they really are going to do a big focus on electrifying transportation, which is also our focus. So there's alignment there, and they're thinking about kind of county-wide electrification of transportation, which is really useful to us because I think there will be a lot of funding for perhaps not an electric vehicle action plan. That might be something we do internally, but actually implementing a plan like that in terms of installing infrastructure, I think that we can get funding through them, and they may leverage some of their funding to work with, was it Electrify America that they're working with, and perhaps other partners. So they're basically filling the gaps. The grants for EV charging have been really difficult, especially for smaller cities. A lot of them, you have to buy and install at least 10 chargers at a time, sometimes in the same location. That's just not feasible for Albany. And so they're finding a way to bridge those gaps for cities that haven't been able to do much on that end. So that's my EBC update.
Did they, when they just did the community innovation grants, they did a call for projects.
Yeah.
Which I actually submitted one for ACAC, but I haven't heard anything back.
Oh.
And they mentioned, when I talked to Phil that runs that program, they mentioned they're going to have grants for cities too. Did they mention that?
That was this, the government innovation grant, second from the bottom here.
Oh, yeah,
are the grants
okay,
for cities.
150K. So there's an opportunity there for us to put something forward.
Yeah, and I think what they're figuring out is exactly, they want to create some criteria for that funding in terms of how we use it.
Right.
So we're still waiting for those details. But either way, they've kind of implied each city is entitled to some of that funding. So I'm not sure that we're going to compete for it. It might be load-based, so we may get a smaller percentage than a larger city. But
Do you know what those are about, the community innovation grants, and what kinds of things are they talking about?
Nick, you might be more familiar with the community.
Well,
innovation
again,
grants.
from what I recall off the top of my head, they were looking for nonprofits to put forward. So we, ACAC partnered with Northern California Solar Energy Association, or NorCal Solar. And, it was grants that were innovative in how they would bring carbon reduction concepts to especially challenged communities and sort of leverage that to maybe include training or some other aspect that would then help the community, but also bring about conversion to electric power or some other way of diminishing carbon. So again, they wanted people to be innovative, and we kicked around. I think Jean Wu and I sat down and we kicked around some ideas, and actually our mayor submitted an idea too, which we sort of prioritized them, sent them around to the group, and then we decided to proceed with, since we didn't get much of a response, the ones we thought were good, which was doing a commercial district solar PV charge station that would be designed by, like community college students with mentor help, and then installed by, again, it was just coming up. We wouldn't be able to do this all over, because I think the largest amount of the grant you could get was, I think it was 50,000. What was the total amount? 150? Yeah, so you could apply for whatever you thought. So the idea would be to come up with a business plan and a prototype. That's what we submitted. So it'd be great to see what was submitted. In fact, I think at their next board meeting, they're going to be reviewing the recommendations of the review team of what was submitted. So that might be a good meeting to attend, their public meeting. I might try to, I don't know, is that still in June, or might be next week sometime, huh? Well, anyway, if people are interested, you can look at that. But it would have been nice if it somehow was up on a website somewhere and you could see what was submitted.
Great. So moving on to 4.3, update on advisory body emails.
Yeah, I think we put this on the agenda prematurely, so I'll give you the update, but it's kind of a half update. So we rolled out new kind of generic email addresses for each committee, and you got a couple tests from our city clerk, and Sue. They work, except we can't find a way to limit the reply all abilities, and typically when we communicate with committees, it's very important for us to blind copy you so that you can't reply all. So if you're getting emails, please remember to not reply all. And in the meantime, we're going to figure out whether we can limit that ability or if we need to come up with another way to have an email address for you all.
So when someone sends an email to that address, it goes to all of our email addresses that we gave you saying this?
Correct.
Oh, okay.
But right now, if you get an email, you have the ability to reply all.
Would we see, does it just come to us from the person who sent it as just us, or does it come to us and we see all the other?
I think you see all the others, but I can't.
Ooh.
I can't be positive.
So that's kind of like a communication outside the
So,
Brown Act.
yeah, so we're kind of going to pause on promoting the use of that, but it's already kind of out there. And so if you do get those emails, just be careful when you're communicating with the committee to not reply all. Yeah, that's it.
All right, and then 4.4, update on committee member transitions.
So, with regret, the committee member Sear, or Vice Chair Sear, has had to resign from the committee. And so the application period for replacing her had just opened today. And so that'll be open for the next couple weeks. If you know people who might be interested, please send them the link. It's on our website under advisory body vacancies. But we're definitely sad to see her go, and we have a proclamation of appreciation for her later on in the agenda. We also have another upcoming committee member transition. I don't know if you would like to share about that.
Yeah, so I will, of course, be leaving next year. I'm going to UCLA. And so I believe I might be able to make it to the September meeting, but we'll have to see. Fingers crossed, because I really want to see the plan finalized. But I'm talking with other students who might be interested in taking this position and working with them to try to find the best fit.
Yeah, I had a question about that. So it's the school district that appoints someone. Mm-hmm. Have school instructors ever been appointed, or is it always a student?
So school instructors, or really anyone as part of the schools, have been on other committees appointed by the board, but this particular committee has in your charter, it actually says specifically it has to be a student. So
Oh,
this is, it's unique to this committee that it has to be a
Okay,
student.
okay, that's fine.
And that was reviewed at the last, when the council reviewed committees and commissions back in December, and they decided to keep it this way.
Yes, I was just going to say that this brings up, not at this moment, but later discussion of how we want to organize these transitions, considering that I'll be leaving and a new member will be entering and figuring out the future chair and vice chair.
Do we need to do anything about vice chair right now?
It's not on your agenda, so we were planning on putting it on your agenda next month.
Okay.
Samantha, you're able to come in July either? Okay, great.
I won't be at the meeting in July.
Okay.
All right, and now moving past announcements on to, do we have a presentation? No presentation today, and so discussion and possible action, beginning with 6.1, proclamation of appreciation for Stephanie Sear.
So for those of you who haven't done this before, we often do this, always do it for committee members when they resign. I'll go ahead and read the proclamation, and then I'll send it around for you all to sign. And I think I have a pen somewhere that you can all use. I don't have a pen. We have a pen. Resolution of appreciation to Stephanie Sear for her service on the Climate Action Committee. Whereas Stephanie Sear was appointed by Rochelle Nason and began her service on the committee in April 2016, and whereas Stephanie served as vice chair beginning in March 2019, and whereas through her work experience as a professional in the Environmental and Energy Programs Department for the University of San Francisco, she offered a high level of expertise to the Committee on Energy Programs, Climate Action, and Resilience. And whereas, as an expert in the field, Stephanie regularly connected the committee with relevant examples of national and international climate policy to help inform decisions. And whereas Stephanie provided valuable input during discussions and gave expert presentations to the committee on a variety of topics, including green infrastructure and sustainable communities. And whereas during her term of service, Stephanie was influential in achieving the city's sustainability goals, including help in shaping East Bay Community Energy, the Home Energy Score pilot, and the development of the new Climate Action and Adaptation Plan. And whereas Stephanie is recognized by the committee for her leadership and wisdom and for her commitment to making Albany a more environmentally responsible city. And now, therefore, be it resolved that the Climate Action Committee does express its appreciation to Stephanie Sear for her service to the city of Albany and wishes her the best in future endeavors.
Very nice.
So it's not quite enough, but it's what would fit on the page. So typically we do, I think we do a motion for this if someone wants to.
Move that we adopt that as written.
Seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Great. And I might go grab them. Do we want a blue? This one? Okay. Just pass it along. Great.
Thank you. Did you want it in blue pen?
It's okay. I think you can use the same. If you use, I'll use the same pen. It's fine.
Yeah, okay, I'll just do the same. Here.
Thank you.
All right, and moving now on to the very exciting discussion of the draft climate action and adaptation plan strategies. I think Claire has a couple comments about what to focus on for this.
Yeah, I actually, I have a brief presentation. So attached to your agenda is the first draft of the Climate Action and Adaptation Plan. It's just the first draft, and we've already noticed there's some just, grammatical errors and things in there. But I'm going to give a brief overview of the timeline for draft review, so you just have that, because you have about an hour and a half for discussion today, we think, to discuss, and we have some suggestions about how to structure that conversation, but I want you to know that you'll get another chance to look at it, just so that you're not worried about that not being enough time. So I'm going to share kind of a timeline of the next steps, and then we can open up for discussion. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about about the plan, some overview, and in particular, one new item. What we did was we contracted with Rincon to analyze our emissions. We actually did a kind of a separate contract with them to analyze our emissions, and including a workaround for the lack of PG&E data that we've had issues with, and an analysis of the estimated reductions from our current EBCE enrollment. And I don't have a lot of details from that analysis. We haven't had a chance to meet with them yet, but they did pop these graphs into the draft plan. So I wanted to share with you briefly, and then we can provide a more detailed presentation on that analysis next month if you'd like. Although if we're providing a detailed analysis on the presentation, then that takes time from your CAP feedback time. So sort of up to you.
I'm
Oh,
saying
sure,
The light
yeah.
level seems to be huge.
Yeah.
Were these always on before? I feel like I'm getting blind.
It is very bright right now.
Well, the spots on us. Remember those? Oh, yes, way better. Thank you.
Is that better? Okay, great. But don't fall asleep. So, so I'm just going to give a brief overview, and again, I won't be very good at answering questions, but you can, maybe during future agenda items, we can talk about if you want to have a further discussion on this. So, according to Rincon, this is our emissions trend starting in 2015 and the EBCE estimate for 2018. Despite Albany's economic growth and population growth, community greenhouse gas emissions have been declining over time. Overall emissions have decreased by 27% from 2005 to 2017. Again, that's with their PG&E data access workaround. When taking into consideration the emissions reduced from opting electricity accounts into EBC's carbon-free electricity service, we estimate that the city has reduced overall emissions by 32%. I still haven't been able to confirm with them if that, I think they're assuming that everyone's in EBCE's carbon-free. And that's not exactly true, so that number may change slightly, but 97% of people are in that, so might not change much. So that's, yeah.
So I have a quick question. Do we have an idea why, because especially the transportation bar, which is the largest of these bars, do we have an idea why that's going down? Why those emissions are going down? And if so, because that's like a big goal of the committee is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through transportation, if we can figure out what's working.
Yeah, that's a great question. My understanding is that transportation emissions nationwide have gone down. Part of that has to do with fuel efficiency standards. Jeff, do you know more about transportation trends?
I don't know the quantitative numbers. I don't have off the top of my head, but it's both fuel efficiency and the excuse me, the fuel mix, the
Ethanol?
yeah, I think they're mixing in different fuel formulas, I guess I should say.
Fuel is more efficient. But there
so
isn't there a
it's
trend
burning
down
cleaner.
in VMT too?
There was between 2008 and 2016 or 17, but since then,
It's gone back up.
as employment has continued to increase and people are driving further and further to get to their jobs, it's ooching back up again.
But there's great hope for your generation in terms of not driving too. So we're hoping to see. I mean, that has been part of the trend is that younger people really aren't driving, and so if that trend continues, that's really great for us too. So.
Wonderful.
I just want to so that does point out that we have very few from Albany, period, very few metrics were sort of tracking that would
In
back
the
up how we're
transportation.
succeeding on CAP and CAP. So I think we need to be a little careful. I noticed this in the report, that we don't just say, hey, we did these things and wow, it all went down and it was all because of that. And that there's nothing that indicates that. Could just be a fluke, could be because of warmer winters, could be because of hybrid vehicles, could be all sorts of things. Now, I'm sure some of that was because of our climate action plan, but now we're getting into more specific actions that people really have to do. And I think we need to keep pushing on that this is happening and we have to do them.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think we could add a section in this portion of the plan that sort of says these are our assumptions about why these numbers went down, and some of it, the fuel efficiency standards, we get to benefit from now and in our future CAP too. So yeah, I think it's important to name that. But we do track VMT, and if it's going down, it's going down. So.
Yeah, that's very encouraging. It's a great trend for transportation. Would it be possible, Claire, if Rincon and the city could share the data similar to what Fanny had done, just so that we can also just see some of the numbers? Because I think the transportation is a key.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things is that it's not necessarily updated. It may be updated every 2 years or something.
Yeah.
And the numbers from last time were probably were older numbers. So I'm assuming they're new numbers
Yeah,
incorporated.
just and to clarify, the reason we contracted with Ryan to do this is because he wanted to make sure that each year had the same methodology, which has been a challenge. But either we can get him to come and speak at the next meeting, or I'll ask him if he's able to share data. I'm not sure how much data he's able to share and what things need to be shared in aggregated form, but I'll check in with him on that.
Yeah,
I'm going to assume that it's the city's data, so hopefully that they can share it. It's not Rincon's data, so
Right.
that would be my hope.
Yeah, there's just a question about some data. We have to sign an NDA, and we can only share aggregated data. So that's what I need to check in on. But we were able to get around that with the last PG&E data that we shared with you. So hopefully it won't be an issue.
How do they calculate VMT? What is that? How do they figure that out? Is that based on car registrations in Albany and?
Well, there are traffic light counters, right, at big intersections like Marin and San Pablo. So that's one way historically. But then they also have a traffic model. So it's probably a combination of those two, but I don't know the exact details.
There's a lot of information on the Caltrans webpage. They track VMT pretty closely on a monthly basis statewide, and then on an annual basis on state highways. And I think that's real data from counts. I would urge caution using any of the regional models when they're looking at Albany, or at least county-wide models when they're looking in Albany, because it doesn't calibrate very well. Yeah. And usually if you just take a model out of the box and run it for Albany, it comes up with bizarre results that need to be tweaked by the traffic modeler it puts because of Interstate 80 congestion, it puts all the traffic on Cleveland Avenue or on East Shore Highway, and those streets get a lot of traffic, but it's not nearly close to what.
And the model for VMT for this that MTC uses also basically we take credit for 50% of a trip that's generated in Albany, and so someone could be driving to San Jose and we're taking credit for that 50% of that trip. So it's hard to say whether that's really the right way to measure what we're responsible for, but because we generated the trip, that's how that works.
I think it would be good for us to understand the methodology, because the measures that we adopt need to have an impact on that number. And if they're not recording things that we're trying to change, that could impact what we do.
Yeah, I think that might come in the implementation plan conversation about how we measure success, and we may measure success. That's why we've sort of been saying some of the measures we're going to measure separately from this data, and we're going to find other ways to measure things that we know are actually going to make a difference but might not be captured in this.
Okay, thank you.
So what does that look like? Estimated 2018 greenhouse gas inventory includes 56% transportation, 23% residential gas, 17% commercial gas, and 4% waste, which actually, when I saw this number, I thought, wow, that actually fits quite well with the way that we've kind of structured this cap. But certainly puts a lot of emphasis on transportation, which we may need to think more about those strategies and how we really make a difference. And of course, the other thing in our cap that's not really measured in our inventory is consumption-based emissions. Some of these emissions are measured in our inventory, but the others we're addressing through our carbon-free economy strategies. So from that, we have our CAP is focused on 4 main goals: electrify our buildings, transition to low carbon transportation, make our economy carbon free, and accelerate resilience for all. And today, what our recommendation to you for a discussion, given the short amount of time we have, before that, I'm going to give you a timeline. So our public review process includes releasing the CAP draft for public comment. We're sharing it with you, and we're sharing it with Economic Development Committee tomorrow, but we haven't widely publicized it yet, but we're going to do that very soon.
It seems pretty rough to me. Can we get our comments addressed, and then that would be what the public would see? Because there's some stuff I think is way off base, and I wouldn't want the public to think that's how we're going.
So because of the timeline, we're looking at releasing the draft hopefully this week, but if there are minor edits, we can incorporate them. The concern about including major edits to the strategies themselves is that we do want to give the public time to weigh in on everything. So that's our concern. So we're releasing the draft. We're doing committee and commission review of the draft. Lizzie's going to those committees, and my next slide shares those dates. And then the public comment period ends at the moment. We're saying once we release it, it'll probably end the week, the Friday after your next meeting. So you'll have another meeting to weigh in. In August, consultants and staff will review public comments and incorporate into the CAP, and also in that time develop the draft implementation plan with funding strategies and metrics, et cetera. In September, we're hoping to do a city council study session to review that next round of the draft, and probably what we'll end up doing is bringing them certain items that came from the public that may not be, if there's not like a real conclusion from the public that we should go one way or the other, we may ask them specific questions. Then the committee will review the final CAP and council will approve. This timeline keeps moving out. So we may, it may not be October, it may be November, but we're being, ambitious and optimistic about this timeline. So committee and commission review, I'll be going to Economic Development Committee tomorrow night, and then Lizzie will be doing planning and zoning, traffic and safety, social and economic justice, parks, rec and open space in June and July. So we'll get their comments specific to their expertise. And then for your review, we're asking for initial feedback and flagging items for a further sort of deeper discussion in July. And then in September, we're hoping that you'll review the final plan for approval, but we may end up bringing back to you in October, depending on how that goes. So tonight, our request is to take 20 minutes for each of the sections and flag the things that you want to talk about as a group, because we're expecting that we can get, Nick already sent us comments, we're expecting that we can get individual comments from you if you want to mark up the draft and send it, or send emails with specific comments. But in terms of what you want to talk about as a committee or make decisions, make sort of policy recommendations on some of these measures, you're probably not going to have time to go through each one of them, nor will you need to. So what we're hoping to get is sort of initial feedback and flagging any of those things that you think would be really good for further discussion in July. And of course, if we get through that quickly, then we can start diving into some of those if you have time. And then we thought it would be helpful for each item for public comment as well, although we'll see how that goes too. So that's my recommendation. That's sort of up to you how you want to structure your conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to do it. And so that would have us beginning with electrification.
I would just comment, and we don't necessarily need to change this, but just given the last pie chart we saw that 56% was transportation and about 40% from natural gas. So we might want to consider spending 30 minutes on, or, just a little bit more time on transportation.
That makes sense.
And maybe a little bit less time on, I don't want to, they're all important, but, maybe just a little bit more time on transportation, just given the weighting of the emissions.
Definitely. I think perhaps then we can start with transportation rather than electrification and see how that conversation is going.
Sounds
So
good.
I'll run the clock just to keep the pace, so you all know where you are, and I'll do 30 minutes for transportation. Is that?
Yeah, that sounds great.
So if we had sort of overall comments that are outside of these categories, should we just save those to the end?
Yeah,
Do you-
Yeah.
maybe that's a shared comment from Nick and myself is there a time slot maybe in the beginning, 5 minutes for overall comments or just general comments?
Yeah,
just
I think
cross-cutting?
that's definitely appropriate, and we can begin with
Okay.
just a 5
Okay.
minutes for.
Okay, so
yeah.
Nick, do you want to start? Or I have some too.
Is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, I think this is a really good effort. I was happy to see, the focus on the strategies we came through and everything. But I found the overall tenor of it a little bit pithy. And I understand the need for being optimistic and being whatever, but it almost bordered on just a lot of cliches being put in. And I would encourage the consultant to just be very concise and more serious and put in more of a tone that this is really essential and critical now. And, the idea that, oh, this is all bold and we're so innovative and we're out on the cutting edge. That's sort of not the main focus of this. What the main focus should be is, look, we've got this last chance and we need to take it, and this is important stuff to do, and it isn't going to be easy, et cetera, et cetera. So I kind of found a lot of the more cliches, sort of Albany will lead and we're great and we have the ability to do it. I don't know if we have the ability to do it. I don't know what they base that on. I think we certainly have the interest to do it, but ability is a whole nother thing. It has to do with financials and stamina and tension and things that I haven't really seen happen yet in Albany. So that was sort of my overall arching comment. And I've got a lot of suggestions in my markup on how they could tune it to make it be more like that. So.
I think it was a good effort also. But just to step back for a moment, I'd like to propose to the committee that we revisit the global targets for the city. They're currently 100% in 2050 and 60% reduction in 2035. And I propose that we visit those for two reasons. One is that the state has a goal for net carbon zero in 2045. So now Albany is 5 years behind that. But the second reason, and more importantly, is as we all know, the IPCC came out with two recent reports. One is that the 1.5C target will be exceeded in less than 12 years. So that really brings in the timeline. Whether you believe we need 1.5C or 2 degrees C is another question. But also the second report just talking about 1 million species loss, and which is happening now. So I feel that the time to be bold, and just in keeping, the time to be bold is now, and in keeping with our past historical record of trying to lead the state, the current targets are not sufficiently aggressive. And the last point is just that the current cap really doesn't refer to the targets explicitly, so I don't think if we change them at this point, it would dramatically change. Maybe it would add a lot more urgency. perhaps, but I just wanted to put that out there. And I know it's kind of a late change, but better late than never, so. So what I'm proposing is maybe 100% in 2040, maybe 60% in 2030, or even more aggressive. But, you know, we don't have to decide that right here and now, but I just want to share that thought.
Thank you. Are there other general comments or comments related to what Nick and Max have both spoken to?
Well, I will just, I liked the overall presentation of it as well. And I agree with the idea that there's definitely a serious component of this. I did like the presentation of, we've made some progress, and I think the people who read this, the general city population needs to be encouraged that this is possible. And I get the point, we don't know if it's possible or not, but I like the parts that said, here's what has already been done, here's the trend lines, it's encouraging. I think there needs to be that encouraging component of it too. So I wouldn't want to lose that aspect of it. I think this document needs to live to encourage people, because it's going to be hard. I totally agree. So, but I liked the presentation of it. I liked well, I guess we can get more details, but I think a little bit more of the how to get to the implementation was certainly, I think we're probably all going to comment on that at some point. But, needs to be beefed up and more specific.
Any other comments?
I had I appreciate what Max has brought up. It was interesting when they went through the adjacent communities and their targets, and a lot of them, even Berkeley, I don't think is as aggressive as us. And some of them are only hitting 80% by 2050. I mean, it's nice to say we're going to make these heavier targets, but maybe what could be worked in is that part of this plan is to monitor and assess on a very regular basis, every couple years or something, and if to see if we need to try harder or if we can change our goals and move them up to a more aggressive point. And of course, we'll always try to do that. But I get a little worried about, I'm worried we won't even make it now, especially when you look at the aspect of rental property, landlords who aren't motivated, all sorts of things that are coming. You need a fair amount of time if you're going to put in more draconian measures where they actually will get big fines, or you'll be red tagging their buildings and shutting them down if they don't do stuff. Now, that sounds all very scary, but this is not a volunteer action. People aren't going to do this voluntarily. We're going to have to encourage them. We can put some incentives, but we're going to have to put in some rules and some measures that force people to do things they don't want to do. And if we have less time to do that in, it's going to be a bigger fight, and it may not succeed. So I like the idea of we hold to this, we see if we can tighten it up as we monitor it. I mean, that would be sort of my suggestion. But Max makes a good point. I mean, time that we lose now is much more valuable. It's like putting money in a savings for college. You can't just do it when your kid gets into 11th grade. It doesn't work. We still are sort of in middle school time. We should be using that time to our advantage. So I could kind of go either way on this, but.
So did you, on page 28, there's the difference. So I'm sure you looked through that. It's kind of like there's a broad range of different types of goals there. And I'm totally fine with matching what the need is, but these goals, when you read through these, Albany would be among the more aggressive of those. So
Already, you mean?
With what we already have, yeah.
Right.
So, what do you?
Well, just as I mentioned, the state has, so it's an executive order for 100% net zero in 2045. So we're 5 years after that. So that's the first point. The second point is just that regardless of what other cities have, it's really a question of what the planet needs. So I don't really use the yardstick of other cities. I use the yardstick of basically, what we all need as a civilization. So, different yardsticks.
Right.
I think it might be best to agendize this discussion as Max
Sure.
proposed, because it sounds like there's a lot to talk about. And we are tight on time with how much we have to cover. So I'd like to jump in to focusing on transportation. And if we want to just go one by one, perhaps, and make any comments on these strategies.
Well, one of the things I see that's not addressed in the transportation proposals directly is one of the sources of traffic within the city. It has to do with the schools, has to do with kids being transported to schools. And, maybe in addition to talking about a shuttle to BART stations, we revise something we talked about many years ago, which is an electric school bus or something to get particularly kids from the west side of town to the schools, which are primarily on the east side of town. And any of us who have walked by the middle school or elementary schools in the morning, you see lines of cars. And to me, that's something that needs to be addressed. We need to figure out a way to incentivize parents to put the kids on a school bus rather than drive them to school on an electric school bus.
I agree with that. I think it warrants its own point. I also notice in other electrification, there isn't, Albany Unified School District is sort of missing. And maybe there should be in each one of these something to try to partner with Albany Unified School District to bring their buildings down to net zero, because that's going to be an aspect. And to improve the transport of kids to where it's by alternative means other than parents using their gas-powered cars. And also there's a health aspect too. So I think it would be good to have Albany Unified School District focused measures in here. Is that appropriate, or since?
We have zero control over them, but we can definitely put it in the plan as we can try our best.
I think Nick's point is that the plan should talk about cooperating with the school district, because they are a source of a lot of these issues, that if we're just acting independently, we need to, we're not going to be as effective, so we need to collaborate with them.
And it's actually, it's a huge part of our community is the schools. Yeah. It's where most of us come together, so.
And I just have to bring up that as far as for the high school, a lot of the traffic comes from either parents dropping off students or students themselves driving to school. And I've talked about safer bike lanes to the schools a couple times, and I really think that's something that we should keep in mind, because I know personally that when I bike to school, I cross on San Pablo where there is no light, and then I go up Portland where I have to weave between parked cars and idling cars crawling towards the school. And I was knocked off my bike by a car door opening right into me, which was not very fun. And I also have to occasionally weave onto the sidewalk to make sure that I'm not between cars that are this far apart. So I think if it's a slight deterrent to me, I consider myself very confident on a bike, it's definitely going to be a deterrent to other people, and especially parents who are rather protective of their children.
So again, I think I like this idea of sort of bringing Albany Unified School District, or that the plan includes them in what we're considering by partnering with them, not by telling them what to do, but partnering with them. And that could actually be done under the new active transportation plan. They could add in references to student transportation, or we could make it its own action item. I kind of like the idea of making it a standalone action item so that it has emphasis.
Yeah, we can definitely do that. We referred to Safe Routes to School programming above and what we're already doing. But I think what you guys are saying is there's things beyond our current Safe Routes to School program that we can employ, and I think that's a great point.
Just a general comment, but specific to transportation as well, is there is an icon for greenhouse gas impact, which I think is that green smokestack icon. It's not clear to me how that's derived. For example, working with third-party programs to provide shared mobility is 2, and working with gas stations to provide alternative fuels is 3 icons. 3, I mean, that's very good, but that's not very clear to me why that's necessarily the case. In the first case, shared mobility or ride sharing may actually increase the amount of vehicles which are circulating around, or it may increase VMT, which is weighed off against the sharing aspect. So it's not, it's not a slam dunk that it's going to be a big win, especially if the vehicles are not electric. So that's something which has been documented in places like San Francisco and Austin. For Albany, it's very different, obviously, but, it's just to put some,
The consultants put in those icons, and I went through and adjusted many of them, but not the greenhouse gas emissions one. So maybe I do think we want people's feedback on, sort of a gut check on those. And so perhaps the easiest way to do that is provide written comments on the icons if you want to flag any of them that you see are probably
those are just
need
2
to be
that jumped
adjusted.
out
Okay.
at me.
Okay, great.
Yeah, if I could make another comment, just for the electric vehicle action plan, it seemed like some of this climate action plan was a plan to create more plans, which was a little bit, disappointing. But I realize that, they only have so much scope. But for this particular one, it seems like maybe it's in here already, but education and outreach is very important in terms of at the point of obviously we want to get away from driving and reduce VMT, but people will still be in the market for cars. So at the point of adoption, when they are retiring their old car, there's an opportunity to intercept them or at least get in front of them. And if they make a choice for an ICE, then that just locks in emissions for another 15 years. So that's a big opportunity lost. The other thing is it might be worthwhile to consider, like within these sectors, building and transportation, to offer or at least pursue some combination of ZEV and electrical heating as an upgrade that maybe you can get a discount if you can bundle, or there's some program which can calculate how much savings you get net, because you could save on ZEVs, but you're paying a little bit more on electrical heating or electric heat pump heating, and you're coming out net neutral or positive. So something like that I think would be creative, and maybe there's a way to knock out 2 birds at one time.
So I on the 2.2.1, the electric vehicle charging infrastructure, I agree with Max that creating a plan for a plan is one thing, but getting to the implementation is what we really need. But because Albany has such a high rental population, I was hoping to see something very specific for landlords in here about how to incentivize and get them to adopt charging stations. So there's a bullet point in here, I think it's number 5, for garage-free homes and rental properties, but it's kind of buried in there. I think a specific action for addressing landlords and multi-unit properties to incentivize charging stations. And then an action that I didn't see here was anything about helping, building on Max's idea of communication, but even, some sort of help for purchasing EVs or how to purchase EVs, or, something in here specifically about purchasing the electric vehicle itself. There's a lot about charging stations in here, but not very much about EVs themselves. So I think an action about that, and I didn't have a fully formed thought on that, but something like that.
Could you talk about that? Explain that a little more?
Well,
because you figure the car companies are going to be trying to get you to buy them.
Right, and we want people to buy them. And Max's idea of communicating at the point of decision-making that, EVs are an option and you should, think about locking into that rather than a gasoline car. But I didn't see a specific action item in here about any help for purchasing EVs, and whether that's incentives or rebates or, special, I don't know what it would be exactly the city could
I know
offer
what it will
or
be.
programs we could offer, but about purchasing the EV, I think that there's,
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. We do work with SunShares. It's a temporary bulk buying program, and they do offer a lot of support for purchase of EVs and also solar panels. But we could put something in there specific that sort of calls out, partner with SunShares, perhaps EBCE for incentives and also sort of like the assistance with purchasing or, education also about the purchasing options.
So,
and then,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
well, my last one was also sort of building on your thing about bike infrastructure, but a specific action about bike infrastructure and building up bike infrastructure in the city. I mean, there's the active transportation plan, which might include that, but, really calling it out of strong, commitment to bike infrastructure.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. Like, the best way to get people off cars for just biking around town is to incentivize them to get on bikes and to walk. And I know working on our Solano plan is trying to help that, especially for like the commercial side of Albany, but just like for getting to school, or as I've brought up, like it's impossible to bike on San Pablo, but if you're trying to, it's strongly discouraged by my parents that I bike on San Pablo. But if you're trying to go that direction, the Greenway can be kind of out of the way, and especially if you're on the hill side of the city, then yeah. So bike infrastructure is really something we should push, I think.
And Preston's been good about helping us understand how to, keep things going. So if we put a specific thing in now, 2 years from now, when something comes up that's, a debate about whether we should do something or not, it's not only just one committee, but it's another committee that said, we are committed to bike infrastructure. And we can always point back to that and say, and here's City Council, this is why we said you should do this.
Yeah, I felt similarly about a lot of these measures. I was also concerned, kind of the emphasis on car share in 2.1 specifically, and I was also a little confused with 2.1.4, which would introduce a policy that allows car share vehicles to park beyond stated time limits, and how that would work, and why car share vehicles was chosen rather than EVs.
Yeah, so it's specific for the example of car share would be gig car, and the idea is we want to reduce the amount of people who need to own vehicles, and so if we incentivize a car share program like gig where people can park wherever they want, then the hope is that maybe people at least become a one-car household instead of a two-car household. And I think there have been pilots in other cities where gig has actually been able to, people can park on Solano, because the idea is right now, if people want to drive to Solano and leave that car share car there, they actually can leave it on Solano.
Okay.
So it sort of disincentivizes the use of that program.
Why can't they leave it?
Because there are 90-minute parking restrictions, and so if they leave it and they want to walk home or something, then they can't do that.
That makes sense. Okay.
Actually,
What was your first point about 2.1?
I think there are core elements of, it's in like 2.1.3, establishing designated rideshare and third-party carpooling, parking, and loading zones. I think it's important. I think it's just, again, a question of, is ride sharing that significantly better for our environment, and looking more closely at that.
So, you're finished. Right?
Yeah.
So I want to, 2.1.2, I think this is going to be this could be like a really great incentivizing plan. Although the way it reads now, I wanted to simplify it more to research feasibility of implementing, well, not even research, implement a parking management strategy to reduce fossil fuel vehicles. So people are going to fight this like crazy, but it would give a huge tool to incentivizing people to have fewer cars, the right kind of car, the whole thing. You could have free parking for EVs, and it would cost you X per year for internal combustion vehicle or something like that. So it is a incredible tool, but it's going to be something very difficult to get through. I see this as being implemented over, a 10-year period with initial introduction and all this stuff. But once it's in place, you have a tool that allows you to really, when people go out to get a car, if they go, I got to pay $250 a year to park my gas-powered car in the street. If I get an EV, it's free. They're going to make the decision very quickly. So anyway, I found this a really, this is a real incentivizing tool that we can implement. We could maybe piggyback, maybe we could make a partnership with Berkeley that already runs a permit system. Can we manage on that? I realize it means more staff. I was thinking, these two little city people here, I think it's maybe going to be 3 little city people. But if you do it right, if you have a real parking management strategy plan that is based on incentivizing people to do the right thing. And I think it's an incredible tool. So I was really happy to see this here. I just think it should be focused on getting rid of fossil fuel vehicles, that those should be penalized, and everything else should be given great subsidy. So you can do that if you have the plan. If you don't have the plan, you can't do anything. You can just, people just complain all the time in Albany mercilessly about parking, yet they own 4 or 5 cars, gas-guzzling cars. So I don't know if anyone else sort of felt that way about it, but I really liked seeing this in here. I was afraid it might, be a little too scary.
Yeah, I actually was going to mention that, just as you were mentioning it, Nick. So I do feel that it could be a very important lever, and it's one of the few levers maybe that can really address this more directly. In terms of a strategy, in terms of the wording, and you had mentioned expanding that or simplifying it to a strategy to reduce fossil fuel consumption, I had actually thought about saying something like just adding some items there to reduce vehicle miles traveled, but also to reduce the number of ICE vehicles and to reduce the number of multiple car households. Of course, this is going to be politically dynamite, but I think this is something that we can seriously consider.
Yeah, it's going to be a tough one.
Yeah, I think just going back to that, I remember when we were initially reviewing with the first transportation list of strategies, the concerns of if we set like a finite date that seems very not flexible, the potential for preventing people from living in Albany, I think, and the cost of that. Because I know I think it was like by 2030, not allowing non-EVs to park was one of the potential measures. And just thinking about that a little bit more is my one concern. But I agree, I think it's really our strongest leverage.
Well, you could cite, they could get a ticket. You're driving an ICE in the Albany, you get a ticket. And we're talking about something that's way down, more like around 2030, 2035. But if you have this plan, you can build on it. If you don't have the plan, there's nothing, you have to bring up each measure of it every time and fight the battle again and again and again and again. Whereas if we put it forward as one thing, implemented, all the cities aware of it, they know it's coming, they know why. There are going to be some people that absolutely won't, and they may move out of the city. Mm-hmm. I don't think there'll be any problem in getting other people to move in. So I was just really glad to see this here, and I think it's a serious thing, and I think it is going to be, as Max said, an important lever, especially on the transportation side, which is our biggest hill right now.
But I'd be careful about saying things like not allowing non-EV cars to park in the city. I don't think legally we could probably do that.
You probably could do that, but you could certainly charge them.
We could not charge EVs to park, but I don't think you can ban gasoline-powered vehicles from parking in the city.
You could charge them a fee. You could charge them a fee.
Yeah.
Yeah. But again, commercial district people are going to be really upset that you're driving their customers away. But I think they'll get other customers that drive EVs. And at some point it'll be moot,
But I also think it's a discussion of, who are these new customers and who's able to have access to these programs, and thinking about, who are we kicking out of Albany?
Well, and yes. Oh, which brought up another point, which was sort of in my general point. There's a lot of talk about vulnerable communities and vulnerable members of the. Do we have a demographic breakdown, even if it's based on the 2010 census, of who are these people, where they are, and how much of the population they make up?
I think that there's some data in the census on that.
We should have that as
But
part
I'd
of
have
this
to, I'd have to
report.
check. I mean, there are like numbers for the number of care accounts, and I think
Yeah.
it's of the order of, 6% or something. I'd have to check. But
It'd just be nice to know that. I mean, suddenly everybody's going to be vulnerable, and that's not how it works, so.
But I think the other side of it is not just looking at the impacts that Albany feels, but the fact that we have, globally, as each individuals, and how that can affect other vulnerable communities around the world, not just in our own local community.
Right, but I would, again, there are people who live in the city that aren't wealthy enough to buy an electric car. Are we going to penalize those people because they can't afford to buy one? That is an equity issue. I think we have to be careful not to.
Right, well, and we're talking about rolling things out over a long period of time. I think you'll find, electric cars I bought one for $6,800, so you can get cheap electric cars now. So it's more like, do they have the home infrastructure to charge it? Does it meet their needs as far as how much miles they go? And so it would be nice to have support. And again, it's this education about people getting an electric vehicle. So, I hear there's a lot of stuff out there about only wealthy people can have electric vehicles. I don't think that's true.
if there's a charge for a parking fee, then that's will generate some amount of revenue that could potentially be used to help offset, those who can, who are maybe care households or lower income disadvantaged households. So, I think it bears further study for sure. But I think it's a very important point that we don't want to price people out of what's already an extremely expensive place to live with another set of taxes and, fees. And
Aside of that, another comment I had was there seems to be a lot of near and midterm actions. I think it's entirely near and midterm, and I understand the urgency, but it just doesn't seem feasible to achieve this much. And I wonder if there's a way to at least prioritize more specifically among the near term or among the midterm, just so it's more realistic.
I agree with that. I found I didn't also find the mid, near term, and long term even had any relevance to the goals. I think long term was 8-year plus. So, we're talking about a 30-year plan, and three of the things sort of top out in 8 years, and it's like you need to think about how these implement in a more detailed way. And too many, it'd be great if we could do all of them in near term, less than 3 years, but I think that's way optimistic. So I had come up with a suggested kind of timeline for implementation, and you'd have near, midterm, long term, and then stuff where we're just going to have to subsidize to get things done at the very end. Like you say, there's some people that'll be not capable of making all the changes to get to zero. So can we set up some sort of program that in the final stages will address that based on need?
I think that's a great point. Our hope is that the implementation plan will have specifics for when these items will be implemented. And the reason they're not in here is because we want the implementation plan to be really flexible, especially if we come up with hurdles that were unexpected. We don't want to, say in here that we're going to do it next year if it turns out that we don't have a legal pathway to do it. And so we want that flexibility in the implementation plan. But you're asking for us to be more specific here or just more strategic?
It just, the only thing we had to go on were those little near-term, mid-term, long-term. And, as Samantha said, there were no long-term ones.
Right.
Or very few. So even some of these are very optimistic for midterm. Midterm didn't seem to be midterm enough, and there's no long-term, and short-term was really short. So it doesn't seem like much thought has been given to what it really takes to implement these.
Maybe redefining those definitions, and then when we bring you the implementation plan, hopefully that is the time to talk about it further.
Yeah, I think we need to see it more on a timeline rather than just throwing something in a column. You really need to see how this, because some of them interact with one another, some you want to do before others. There's really, some need to be ramped up. They start as voluntary, then they become more mandatory, and then they become punitive. All that sort of fits in with how, the implementation strategy. So I think this first pass of when you would do them is just really broad. And we're already jumping ahead and thinking the strategies of the implementation. So, and in fact, at one point I just said, wow, there was one page that said, there's going to be all this stuff putting forward. And I go, wow, I'd really love to see a draft of that, because that's where the whole effectiveness of implementation is going to happen, or your success. Yeah.
Are there any other comments about this transportation portion
Yeah,
specifically?
so sort of on the vein of presentation, this is a good section for this comment, and I know you said that they were still working on the formatting and that sort of thing, but presenting this so that you get the best, biggest bang for your buck ideas up in front, and you really sell those as part of the this is what we really want to do, and then here's some here's the laundry list of other stuff in that category. So I get the way they did this with goal 1, decrease passenger vehicle miles traveled. By the time you get to the end of page 38, you're kind of down into encourage density through infill development, and people are kind of losing interest, at that point. And then on the next page, there's goal 2, transition to electric vehicles, which I personally think that's a huge thing. And so maybe it's just the way that it's labeled or presented, but I would want to see, okay, goal 1 and then the big stuff, really important stuff, and then goal 2, really important stuff. And I know you want to list all the stuff that's in goal 1, but the way I kind of get lost into, now we're talking about electric vehicles. Well, why is this so far down? Maybe it's not that important. So just some sense of prioritization, or some sense of selling the big best ideas so that they really pop. And then, we want to keep the other stuff too, but.
Yeah, and it might be that, again, I think the implementation strategy comes into play here with others being more long-term, like encouraging density, whereas transitioning to EV might be more rapid. And so maybe there's a graphic that shows them along a timeline, and you can say, here are the primary ones, and they're popped there, and then it shows the page where you go to read about them. And then you get this in sort of this, I understand why they're doing this, because they presented them in this manner. It's a logical organization, but I like that idea of having some things that pop out, and you see them, and people can go and read about them right away.
Any other comments? Well, then it seems that we can move on to electrification then.
Did you want to do public comment for each
Yeah, of
section?
course. So here's an opportunity now to give public comment on transportation specifically.
And we had agreed on 2 minutes because we'll do it for each section.
Great, thanks. Hi. Yeah, exciting to see a lot of the measures in here. I would agree it's a lot of measures. I'm also curious what the time frame is that this plan will be operable over. So I don't think it's intended to be the plan that would be in place all the way through 2035. I mean, usually these things get updated every 5 to 10 years. So I don't know if there's any. I didn't find any statement in here about that, but I think that would be helpful to have. And in that regard, I mean, probably there'd be no smokestacks for this first one here, because developing the active transportation plan doesn't do anything in and of its own right. So I think, and I support, there needs to be some more definitive measure in here, like actually implement the plan. That's where the smokestacks come in. And the last statement says bike network that favors protected bike lanes where feasible. That's kind of like a double qualifier. So I would ask that where feasible gets eliminated or favors gets eliminated or something, make it a little stronger. And even then, I would say it's a step back from the last climate action plan. So the last climate action plan had a stage 1 cycling network, which was basically paint and sign. And then it specified a stage 2 cycling network, which was cycle tracks and protected bike lanes. And so I would ask you to look back at the last climate action plan for what the measure it had and make this one at least as strong as that, not weaker than that. And then I also wonder about the one smokestack. I mean, we don't really know how it's going to play out in American culture, but in other cultures that have really adopted strong bike network facilities, they've had tremendous reduction in the use of internal combustion engine vehicles, even up to like 50% of trips going to active transportation. So that would seem to warrant more smokestacks than one. But again, I don't know. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
This is my first time here, and I'm not really aware of all the stuff that's gone on before, but I think that it's really, really important that you push the EVs
Please
and
introduce
adoption
yourself, Jean.
of EVs
Jean,
way ahead.
Introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry. My name's Jean Wu. I live in Albany. I've been here for over 30 years. I have 3 electric-type vehicles, and yes, many people have more than one vehicle. I just think it's going to be really important that we have more chargers. So if we had more chargers and we made it possible for people to put chargers on the street in front of their house if they don't have a garage to put it in, then there would be more people getting electric vehicles.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, good evening. I'm Ian McLeod. I'm on the Planning and Zoning Commission here on my own. I support all the ideas about protected cycling infrastructure. I think it works. It has to be a comprehensive policy. It could really be a key component along with safe routes to schools. I think it also goes hand in hand with parking reductions. Other cities that I'm familiar with, mostly Europe, this parking reduction type program is geared towards commercial districts where they eliminate pretty significant chunk of the commercial parking and they charge for what's left over. And that, in conjunction with bicycle infrastructure, reduces vehicle miles traveled. That's the key way to do it. So we have 2 opportunities here immediately in Albany. One is the San Pablo corridor, the other is the Solano Avenue corridor. So this is the major place where we could put protected bike infrastructure within, the planning is happening now. So if you don't make a forceful statement about requiring that or promoting that, I think it's just going to fall on, it's just going to be too late. So it's happening now. The opportunities are right now. I really see all the protected bike infrastructure as a key part of the Safe Routes to Schools program as well. Some way to get people up and down Portland and Washington without dodging car doors, without dodging people pulling over suddenly to let their kids out of the car. It's a significant population. When the school's over in June, you see an instant reduction in traffic on our streets. So those are all people that could be on bikes or other shared mobility devices. The other things, okay, I'll stop.
Thank you.
I want to mention we'll be taking written comments by people too throughout the public comment period.
Are there any comments on these? public comments?
Yeah, I think we heard some compelling arguments for making the safe bicycle travel a much bigger emphasis. Because I think part of what needs to be conveyed is that it's not just emissions reductions, it's a safety issue. And because, that's what this is all about, is the health and well-being and survival of the residents. So I think that I'm glad these points were brought up. I think we need to go back to the current cap, adopt some of that language, and I think we should be specific about protected bicycle lanes.
All right, so now moving on to electrification. So that's going back to strategy 1. And again, we'll go through now with 20 minutes, so less time for this, and going through one by one, making any comments.
I had one comment on the mandate fuel switching. It's 1.2.10. So it's identify a pathway for requiring all electric energy in existing and new buildings. So I think that should be split out because I think, new buildings, it's a lot easier to do it. And I would recommend that we have stronger language for that, like require new buildings to be all electric. I just think those are different problem statements, so I don't know that we should lump them together.
Just to follow on that, I think there's a little bit lack of clarity on, that was the only place where you saw getting rid of gas-powered buildings, and then there was this 1.2.6, which was sort of strange. It says adopt an administrative policy that states natural gas equipment is not required to be installed in construction projects. I don't know where you would think it was required. So this is sort of a non-thing. It's sort of dodging the issue, which was really disallowing gas on new construction projects. So I don't like this 1.2.6. It seems kind of wimpy and sidestepping the issue. If we're incentivizing fuel switching, just saying, well, you don't need to put the gas furnace in, it's not required. I don't really know how that helps at all. And I think we need to have a better strategy than that for, and then later at the one that Max, which was now midterm one, was identify the pathway requiring all electric energy in, I would say, major remodelings and new buildings, but new construction. And then splitting them is very essential because the pathway for existing buildings is going to be much more complicated. And then I would say that the pathway for new construction should be a short term, whereas the pathway for the others would be mid and maybe even long term.
Yeah, 1.1 is mandate all electric construction for new buildings, so.
Oh, okay, 1.1.
So I guess it's just 1.2.10 would be focused on existing buildings, I think.
Yeah, okay, good.
Yeah, I agree. There's nothing in the code that says you can't build an all-electric building, so that 1.2.
Yeah, I didn't understand what
Doesn't
the
make
point
any
was of
sense.
1.2, especially because we have.
Maybe I can address that for a second. I completely agree with your observations. It is something that the consultant felt strongly about because apparently in other jurisdictions there are building departments that even though there's no reason not to do it today, they're requiring buildings to have a gas hookup.
There are major barriers that I hear from other communities with their planning departments.
It's not a barrier for us, and the solution okay, we'll have an administrative policy that makes it clear that we're not going to do that here. It's not a problem, but if people need a memo to be comfortable with that, I'm happy to do it.
And in 1.2.7, I'm not sure why there's a but in the last sentence after the comma. But this might be possible through, why would there be an editorial comment in something like this? It should just be, this is what we're doing. I think that didn't make any sense to me.
Does that have to do with the fact that,
To put
are they
pressure
talking
on
about the,
PG&E, other cities would have to do it, but
well, the Public Utility Commission, or is that what they're trying to reference?
We can change the way that it's phrased, but the intent of the sentence is to say the city does not have to do this alone because when we've brought this to council before, we've said it's also $850,000 to $1 million to change PG&E's billing system, and so we're not going to do that alone. So maybe there's another way to phrase that. It's to say work with PG&E on this through our regional
Are
partnership.
the utility taxes, that's still part of PG&E's billing? The electrical didn't go over to
PG&E
EBC?
still handles billing
No.
the other
for
thing,
the near future, at least.
Nice to be a monopoly.
The other thing I don't really like in this is any talk about doing research. I don't think doing research has a place in a cap. I think this is what we're doing, or this is what, this is what the intention is. There's 1.2.8. I think if we
Yeah,
want
I
to
said-
require that new construction be carbon neutral, I don't know that we need to define what the technology is. We just say any new construction would need to be carbon neutral. Maybe there's some technology that comes along that, like, a fuel cell that's, can be operated without natural gas in a commercially viable way. So,
Yeah, I agree, and even if it is a specific thing like this, I mean, this is a near-term one, so hopefully the consultant has some specific things, and it should just be like you say, a proposal, just do it, and, then if it ends up requiring some research, well, then do that, but just, yeah, more directive.
I want to back up, Tom, on this use of words like research and identify a pathway, and, once you do that, this should really be taking action. It's climate action plan. So I agree. So I had scratched out research feasibility and just said support. Partner with EBC to support requiring electrical panel upgrades during major retrofits. And I think the idea there is you come up with a way that it's mandatory, and maybe there's credits or some sort of things come through EBCE if you do it because you're electrifying, and we can work all those details out later. But yeah, it isn't just the feasibility. We don't want to know, of course, anything's feasible, right? It's just a matter of money and political will. And so also further down on 1.2.10, identify a pathway for requiring all electric, just, develop requirements for all electric energy, and you'll implement it over a certain, I think what they mean by doing this is come up with a plan that has a time frame for requiring all electric energy in existing and new buildings. I don't think it's just identify the pathway. That's kind of not.
With these ones like research feasibility and identify a pathway, that's exactly what we mean. We mean identify a legal pathway. We're not positive right now what the legal pathway is, what authority we have to do
But we want
these
more
things.
than the pathway. We want to then make it required. So develop means to require all electric energy in existing and new buildings. So anyway, I mean,
it could be a goal of
Yeah.
the cap, and maybe it's, it stays as a midterm goal, but for us to identify a pathway, I mean, that's what you do as part of the implementation. Once, if there's a cap initiative or cap requirement to electrify, say, same thing with the city buildings. It has this language to develop a plan for how you're going to electrify city buildings. You should say something like, electrify all city buildings by such and such a date, or, something where you have an actual target that you can measure, because otherwise it's something that's going to have an impact that could take the entire length of the cap, and you never achieve it because it's not something you're not focused on the goal.
So I had another tough nut to crack is the landlord. So 1.2.3, I was glad to see there's a specific one about landlords, but this is just city providing information about contractors. So I would like to see something that's very more directive about the city engaging rental property owners to incentivize electrification or something like that. We had a nice user group here, and they gave some things. What could we do to incentivize you? Oh, you could do this, you could do this. So I think there are levers that can be used. So I think another separate one from this that was more directive towards the city will find ways to incentivize landlords to electrify buildings would be good. Again, such a high rental population, and
Yeah, I was going to comment on that one also. I think given that half of the population are renters, that this is a very, very difficult market, just with the split incentives problem. And so this did seem like not really quite up to the magnitude of the task or the challenge and the necessity to address this. So to the extent that there can be something in there about not necessarily inventing things, but adopting best practices or working closely with other cities like maybe Oakland or other East Bay cities, or financing, which is the next bullet, but specific to property owners and rental units, I think is really important.
Yeah, I had similar comments like that. The other thing is, under benefits, this could be an equitable thing, seeing as that probably a lot of folks that are more vulnerable are renters, and people that own large multi-unit buildings could be a little bit more not poor off. Of course, it's all specific, but depending on how the incentives and the motivations and the requirements that you put on building owners, we have to be mindful of how that trickles down and creates costs for renters. So this is a complicated one.
yeah. The other thing
Go ahead.
So,
It's okay, go for it.
the other I didn't see anything about appliances in here, and specifically, information, incentives, whatever to
Ooh, there was something.
homeowners, residents, whatever about appliances. The whole fuel switching, and so I don't know exactly how to form that, but something. Actually, there is incentivized fuel switching, so maybe something under that with information and incentivization for appliance switching.
I think this has been touched on before, but I was also going to say that the benefits aren't necessarily accurate, considering that a lot of these actions don't really say that there's action happening. It's like partner with somebody or research, and if you're just researching, we can't really say that there's a clear emissions benefit from that. And again, changing that verbiage maybe, and in effect, changing the time frame to long-term rather than putting in research here and saving that for our implementation plan.
Oh, Eric, 1.2.5 talks about incentive programs and then appliances such as panel upgrades, electrical appliances, and heat pumps.
The last one, I think, is support state efforts to decarbonize buildings and vehicles. So I'm going to assume that we would do that it doesn't need to be in the action plan necessarily. Maybe we could put something like aggressively pursue state or local grant opportunities or work with other local jurisdictions to adopt best practices. But I just feel that we should also already be supporting state efforts unless there's something very specific, which we normally wouldn't be doing.
Yeah, I even wrote down, not sure what support means. Need more clarity. Also, what would be the cascading benefits? So this was just kind of this seemed really vague and squishy, and I like Max's suggestion that, is it suggesting a lobbying effort? I don't know. Or just pursuing grants. Maybe that's what it is.
Any other comments on this portion? So now we have an opportunity for public comment, and again, 2 minutes for each speaker. If you would like to come ahead and step to the mic, please.
Hello, I set bad precedent last time by not introducing myself, Preston Jordan. On the utility user tax measure, there's two different approaches to that, and that what this measure is talking about specifically is increasing, but there's actually two different flavors of this. One is restructuring the existing tax to basically push the burden over onto natural gas, which would provide an incentive against using more natural gas. And that would need PG&Es to change its billing system. The other flavor is to levy a new additional tax on top of the existing tax. That could either be on natural gas if PG&E redoes its billing system, or it could be done now on both electricity and natural gas. And the funding from that could be used for various subsidy programs. So at the first Berkeley Energy Commission meeting regarding its natural gas prohibition ordinance and the feasibility of building all electric, that workshop is on multi-residential buildings, I met a program manager from Stop Waste who's actually working to develop, I guess it's one of many agencies that are working to develop a Bay-wide mid-market incentive program where they would be educating contractors and providing contractors, both the knowledge of the subsidy and the technology, because when my water heater blows up, what do I know? I go to the contractor, and so it's really the contractor that's the point of the intervention. So what that told me is if we come up with money locally in Albany, even if it's both a tax on electricity and natural gas, which is not ideal but good, then there will be a regional program into which we can plug that money, because it always was, one of the barriers was always it was infeasible to have Albany alone do something in this regard, but we can piggyback on a county-wide and regional effort. So it's not dependent on PG&E was my point.
Thank you.
Hi, Ian McLeod again. I've been doing a lot of research on all electrification for buildings, and in particular, I've learned a bit more about multifamily buildings, and there are a lot of feasibility studies right now and a lot of cost studies that show it's actually cheaper than going all electric is cheaper than installing gas into these new multifamily developments. I've shared some of that with the Albany Climate Action Group, and I still need to do some more research, but the basic upshot is that it's definitely feasible, and this is something that I think as part of prohibiting new natural gas hookups would be evidence that it does work. So the only other thought I was having, in Berkeley they do a seismic rebate of a sales transfer tax as part of their real estate sales taxing, and that goes back to residents who retrofit their homes for a seismic upgrade. So there might be some mechanism like that that could be applied in Albany that could be applied towards upgrading or retrofitting and getting rid of gas appliances, something like that. I mean, it's some other mechanism that works in Berkeley for a different purpose, but it could be done here. That's it for right now. Thanks.
Thank you.
Brian Martin, Albany resident. On this particular issue, just wanted to mention that my next door neighbors who moved away a few years ago, they maybe 10 plus years ago, with the environment in mind, took out all the gas in their house and put solar panels on their roof and put passive solar heating for the water. And the new owners are using that system. One thing to watch out for, at least with the passive solar heating, is that it didn't work as they were hoping, and they were also using that to warm up, do floor heating, what do you call that?
Radiant, yeah.
Radiative heating. And the system was like way more complex than it needed to be. They had huge hot water heaters that were like preheating and heating and preheating, and so there's ways that make it more complicated, but hopefully this body or other bodies can come up with some simplest thing. As someone who's installed hot water heaters on my own property before, I know the thermal requirements are pretty high, and so can electric, replace a gas very effectively if it's on demand and not a tank. And so some of the details need to be worked out. Thanks.
Thank you. Any comments on those comments, or are we ready to move on? Great, so now moving to, let's see what's next. Making our economy carbon-free. So that is strategy number 3. And again, if anyone would like to begin with their comments for this section.
One general comment on this is that I think that this is a laudable goal. I'm not sure how we measure or monitor this. There's measure 3.2.3, which is strategies to incentivize waste reduction. So that's one potential way that you are reducing your solid waste. But in terms of consumption otherwise, it just seems like this is sort of something which we think is a nice thing to do, but it's hard to, otherwise I'm not sure how we quantify it or how we track it. So it might be valuable to put in something to that effect to say, we'll study or we'll try to adopt measures to try to, how can we actually quantify this?
Looking at the benefits again, and looking back at the prior categories, having double smokestack things is kind of interesting on some of these, even single, because well, anyway, it seems like it's difficult to figure out exactly where those land, but I guess we'll just trust our consultant. On 3.2.4, and this came up on some earlier ones too, I think training should also include designers and not just contractors, although I think with a lot of the small scale changes, the contractors are going to be more the ones making those decisions. But if someone can, at a design point, especially with a large remodeling or project, you want the designers knowledgeable on that too. So it might be good to specifically, architects, engineers are up on carbon smart building materials.
I was hoping to see some things in this section related to things like getting, electrifying operations for the city, not just the purchasing, so that, that we're looking at things like the leaf blowers versus brooms, or which contributes to pollution. And other types of consumption-related issues connected to plastics that that your purchasing policy would move the city away from utilizing single-use plastics in any form, and focusing on health issues associated with chemicals in the products that the city is using, or processes that the city is using, like integrated pest management and things like that. I think there's an opportunity to address some of those issues related to pollution here. Because, the things like the farmer's market, I know we tried that a number of years ago. To me, that is not going to move the needle at all. because since we're surrounded by other cities that have farmers markets, I don't know how that, you know, it's more of a quality of life kind of thing, so it makes it more convenient for people, but I don't know. This section seemed to be the weakest of the three. And maybe because it's more difficult to measure some of the action items, but that's my comments.
I agree. I think that it's the section that needs the most description of why this is even important. I think that's the one that's hardest to get your arms around, about why upstream manufacturing matters and how not to produce more anxiety about the whole process, because it's like, how do you identify what's the best thing? So I think a little bit more education in this section would be good, or some sort of graphics about how you know, why it's important, how you identify the best path, and then some of the actions. Because, I mean, yeah. And the farmer's market, with the little smokestack thing, I thought it was funny that there's no carbon reduction in there at all as a benefit, and yet it says in the description, avoid additional greenhouse gas emissions associated with packaging and transport. So, again, a little bit more consistency and some explanation of where that comes from. Because I think that's a good way, and especially, Tom, your comment, yeah, there's farmers markets around us, so patronize them would maybe be a better one rather than creating a new one.
I had a question about where, you know, air travel has always been a big thing. Maybe that came up earlier under transportation, I'm not sure. But sometimes it's seen as an economic choice of travel plans and whatever. But does that get addressed somewhere in our plan of
Right.
Yeah, we talked about it in the subcommittee, and we hadn't come to any conclusions about how to address it. So we did on Friday as we were posting this. I was like, we don't have air travel in here. So let us know if you have any ideas about how to address it.
Yeah, well, it might be in this section of promote. Actually, I had someone mention to me, someone on the council, that maybe there'd be a way for Albany to offer carbon offsets in some manner that, you know, that would, you could get your carbon offsets locally. Like a tree would be planted if you did, or something, I don't know. But that was just something that someone had brought up with me.
You know, we hadn't included, that's a good question for the committee too. We hadn't included offsets specifically in this because of their unpopularity. There was a conversation at the subcommittee meetings that wasn't something that we wanted to include or define in the carbon neutrality definition, besides anything that's like a true carbon sink. So let us know if you feel differently, but that was what we'd taken from the committee originally.
As far as like carbon balancing, I know there's a company called TerraPass that does, I believe you can, so for individuals you can, I believe, calculate your footprint and then pay to like offset that. And they work that, I know because I've seen a couple bumper stickers that are like, this car's carbon emissions balanced by TerraPass. So that's maybe something to incentivize, or maybe just get the word out that that's an option.
I agreed with previous comments just about the farmer's market and whether or not it's worth putting in this, considering how much else we're trying to achieve, and how, I guess, less quantifiable and relevant to this specific plan the impacts are. Were there any other comments?
Just a thought on that. Maybe, I mean, we have one big, but we've got Sprouts here, and I don't know if there's a Safeway. Maybe we could just encourage local markets to have more, some kind of feature of local produce, you know, or try to encourage them. Although I wouldn't want them to compete with Monterey because that's already there. So it's like, yeah, why do we need a farmer's market?
Yeah.
3.2.4, to me, this sounds like something that would be a building code item rather than, you know, making it, the impact is not going to be made by doing education or incentives. I think it's going to need to be something that's written into the the city's building code if and when those products are commercially viable and something like that. Because this, I don't see how the way this is described is going to do anything. The financial incentives may make up for a difference in the delta and the cost, perhaps, but why would somebody use that carbon sequestering material if they didn't have to? Only if the client says, I want a building with these products. So I think if we're going to look at something like this, it should be something in a future change to the building code. Because otherwise it's just going to be very minimal impact. So either do something like that or don't have something like this in there. I'm not even sure that the technology is prevalent enough right now. What do you think, Jeff?
I agree with you. I don't know anything about the technology.
Yeah, I mean, there are companies developing things like this, but I could see this as something like in the future, adopt these kind of things to the building code. But I don't like the way this is written because nothing will happen.
That's a really good point. We spent yesterday's meeting at Stop Waste playing a game that Mia Kitahara had developed to basically teach people about embodied carbon in buildings, and we worked in a team to try to reduce carbon emissions from a city while still developing the city and having to meet targets for commercial building and residential units. And we learned a big lesson about how much carbon. She has a whole calculator. So I think we actually do, from that lesson, I thought we need to think more strategically about how we address embodied carbon emissions, which we're not calculating in our inventory, but if we actually looked at them, they would be a huge portion of our emissions. So I know we don't get a lot of new buildings, so maybe it's not as important to us as it would be to certain other communities in the county. But perhaps we can consult with Stop Waste to find a way to make this a little more impactful of a measure.
Or maybe they could, if we could highlight what the big, is it concrete? Is it, what is it? I mean, what are the big offenders? And not just, carbon smart materials, it sounds so, it's almost like a buzzword kind of thing, but it doesn't tell you anything, so.
3.2.1, if you can. I was just looking at that, and that's like an example of a really good one where it has like a really specific, action, and then it goes on further to say why it's good, and then when it'll be adopted, and how. It's really funny because that's like really well done. Is that like something that's already being done?
This is 2.3.1. Or 3.2.1.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is
The
that
reason
something that's already being done?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's why.
That one's been all the way thought.
Yeah. So it hasn't started yet, but
if they want a model of what's good, that's
great.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
So just to follow up on one comment that Eric made about this doesn't provide a lot of guidance or a plan to provide guidance about what people can do or what has a high impact. So there's nothing in here about eating lower down the food chain, so I don't know how people feel about that, but that can have a big integrated impact. But maybe that could be something like partnering with another organization, maybe Stop Waste, to have a program for reaching out to school-age kids or something like that. But I think the point you made was good to just highlight what are big impact items. Aviation, we had just talked about also.
Any other comments before we open up to public? And so now we have another opportunity to present public comment for 2 minutes again, we ask, considering the time constraints tonight. All right, so then moving on to our last strategy section, which is titled Accelerate Resiliency for All. So I don't know if we want to take the same approach and go one by one.
Can I say something real quick? I think we had an interesting test of this in the past week or so when we had the over 90-degree temperatures in Albany. And I think how our city responded to that is a good example of how we could deal with future issues, especially with extreme heat. And I mean, that's an example of resilience that's brought up often is heat waves, because they're going to be hitting us more often and they're going to be way worse. So if we can, just for an immediate thing, just considering that maybe like a consideration of how the city responded to that event and then how we could improve our response in future events.
4.1.1, this actually reminds me, I had a meeting with our urban forester, Jack Hawkridge, is that his name? John, right. And then also Stephen Prey, who's the environmental programs manager with El Cerrito, and he's also their urban forester, really. And they brought to my attention, there's an urban tree volunteer group called Richmond Tree that's very successful in the city of Richmond. And I think in here it would be good, the comprehensive street tree plan, especially after talking with John, having a good volunteer organization that promotes and supports plantings of trees is critical. So I'd like to see that included in there.
Did John suggest that he was going to coordinate that volunteer group? Because that's why we took it out.
No, he didn't. All I'm saying is that, and this wouldn't be on John to do. I mean, he's got enough stuff. But developing that would be a volunteer group. So the group in Richmond is actually affiliated with Earth Island Institute.
Okay, so it would be a nonprofit agency that.
Right. No, I'm not saying that. Anyway, there's already a program where the city will plant the trees, and if you identify where you want them and they do them, and you request them and all that. But this would even go beyond that and try to proactively do it with volunteers. Just Google Richmond Tree, and they.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great idea, and we had it in here, but for some reason we're sort of leaning on the rec department, and they're really not the tree people, and so that's our challenge, is figuring out.
Well, what did Public Works say? Don't put in a volunteer tree group?
I don't know that we addressed. That's why I was asking if John had said something.
Well, it seemed like he seemed supportive of the idea. He'd love to have help from volunteers.
Okay.
That's sort of the sense I got from him when we met. Right. You seem surprised.
No, I mean, I think a volunteer group is great. We haven't identified who has the capacity to administer a program like that or coordinate volunteers.
Well, the volunteer group would coordinate itself, and they would just, they would make sure they were following what the city wanted and just notify them or whatever. I mean,
Then it's not really a city program.
No, but it's something that needs to be developed. So, I mean, there might be some city energy initiative. I mean, this is the city including citizens doing stuff too, right? I mean, or is this all only stuff that the city, as in city employees, do?
I think this is a city-led program that we use partnerships. We leverage partnerships.
Oh, well, then it's a partnership with a volunteer organization. Anyway, if it was considered and then bumped out, I was pretty excited to see that there is a comprehensive street tree. Another thing is that John seemed to think that without an inventory, you're sort of at a loss, but doing an inventory is a big deal, but you could leverage that with a volunteer organization. Have local neighborhood groups maybe coordinated with the CERT that would go around and categorize all the trees. So it just seemed having a good active urban tree group that was a volunteer citizen group would be helpful. And if that is part of the street plan, or maybe it's a separate thing. I don't know.
Any other comments on this section?
Well, I think in 4.41, in addition to poor air quality, we need to address the issue of the heat. You know, that during the life of this cap, the temperatures are going to continue to rise. And what we experienced a week ago
Excessive heat.
could become more common. So there needs to be safe places for people to cool off, or particularly the young and elderly that are the most vulnerable to heat events. Something related to providing safe havens, similar to what I would imagine you do, like at the community center or the senior center or other city facilities, that they would also be designed as a place of where people could get relief from the heat.
Oh, I assumed we don't have cooling centers in there?
I don't see
And
it.
maybe because it's in our local hazard mitigation plan. It might be in the what we're already doing section. I bet it's in the what we're already doing section.
I think just to add to that, it would be a good idea to look to, because for the city of Albany, extreme heat events are becoming more and more common, but there are other cities where they are like very common already. So looking to their plans and what they do to mitigate the impacts of these, because extreme heat can be deadly, and it's important to make sure that it is as non-deadly as possible. So for example, as for elderly residents can be hit really hard by heat, especially if they don't have access to like a support network or to air conditioning. So, as far as like making neighborhoods aware of people who are at risk in extreme heat events, and just trying to get people to mobilize to help people who aren't really able to help themselves in these situations. And maybe putting out more media about how to deal with extreme heat, like that if we set up these resources, let people know that the resources are available. Because I do know that the city sent out an email about the extreme heat, but I'm pretty sure I'm subscribed to the city newsletter, and I'm not sure if I got it, and I know not everyone in the city is subscribed to the city newsletter, so if we could figure out a way to more reliably get this information out, just so the people are safe, yeah.
So I see that you have it listed here under what we're doing. Is that something that's about to be completed? Is that why it's not a measure?
Yeah, well, we actually did it. We expanded our capacity. We added air conditioning to the senior center, and then during the heat wave last week was the first time that we'd officially opened our cooling centers and sent out information. And we can certainly push it harder next time with all our avenues.
Do we provide something like that for the west side of the city?
We could look into that. Yeah.
Yeah, people get kind of isolated over there, particularly older people, if they're living in the apartments or however, maybe they already have air conditioning, I don't know. But
I don't know if that's air conditioned.
But it's something you should look at, because all the city facilities are next to San Pablo or east of San Pablo.
Yeah.
So might be a problem for other folks.
So just to echo, I think, some previous comments, I think this section could be restructured to be a little bit clearer in terms of what the measures are addressing in terms of the risk. So for example, the heat resiliency is increased risk, and in terms of safety to vulnerable, as Allison was mentioning, to vulnerable populations, it could be viewed as maybe one of the higher risks. So that section on addressing climate-related risk could be brought up to the fore. And similarly, goal number 1 increasing urban tree canopy cover, I feel that's like an approach and not a goal. So the approach, or the goal there could be to develop greater heat resiliency, and that could be an approach. But there could be other approaches, such as cooling centers or cool surfaces or cool roofs. So it just seemed like this was a little bit jumbled in that sense. And so just calling out what the purpose is, like the goal to increase resiliency of built environment and infrastructure, that's pretty general also, but that might be okay. But just, just clarifying what's the purpose of, and maybe prioritizing them, yeah.
Right, because we're talking about the heat island effect, and how are we mitigating that in construction and just, existing landscaping and
Excuse me.
roadways and pathways.
Yeah, I mean, one other comment on 4.2.1, it says prioritize adaptation and resilience in discretionary capital improvement program projects. So I do wonder about that, if there's a potential conflict between adaptation and resilience and greenhouse gas mitigation. Hopefully those can be synergized, but if there is a conflict, I just wonder, is that what we're saying now is we're shifting to adaptation and resilience as as having the primacy. In the case of energy efficiency in general, greater energy efficiency can lead to greater resilience, but if there's a conflict, I'm just wondering how that would play out.
Yeah.
That's a really good point. Did you see a specific conflict in that item?
Well, I don't want to be pushing this too far, but if you are relying on the grid if we're going to say we're going to electrify everything, we're going to electrify our cars, we're going to electrify our heating, and if there's a grid outage, and we're saying we're relying on East Bay Clean Energy, and we don't have anything in here on solar PV, except, one bullet here in this particular section for city facilities. But then you could make the argument that we're more vulnerable, or we're less resilient than with a natural gas system, because the natural gas system will not go out.
Yeah,
That sort of thing is a potential. I'm not saying that that's common and that will happen, but just that sort of
Could that
idea.
be covered under the advocate for?
The storage.
These things that improve and improve the resiliency of the grid, and, you could locate battery energy centers
That's
around
in here.
in the grid.
Yeah, that's in
and
here a little
those
bit.
could operate, although it'd be difficult. If PG&E shuts it down, they're going to they won't let you put energy into it, and they're the ones that,
But I think
Batteries generally will last about, I don't know how long they won't last.
yeah, if you don't have solar
For
to
several
charge them up
days,
again.
yeah.
But I
That's
think in
true.
the earlier thing, it talks about encouraging microgrids.
Yeah,
and
that's true.
So that would address being able to island the
Yeah.
city and survive, something like that.
Yeah, and we should address storage in here for more than just the city, and if we don't, we'll make sure that we.
For emergencies, you mean, yeah. So rather than flipping on a big diesel generator,
that's a piece of it, but there's also the focus on storage for, with electrification, we can also be looking at solar storage projects for single-family homes and businesses.
So there's a little bit on the promotion of this whole area. Again, this is a harder one to sort of describe to people. And on page 27, there's the the statement about why we chose these 4 different things, and the trees and green space. One of the co-benefits is beautification and sort of that idealized. Albany is going to be a more beautiful place if we do this. And then this description of this section doesn't really go into that at all. So I think that maybe this is another opportunity to kind of promote why this is important, why this is echoing Albany's ideals kind of thing, in order to get to again more buy-in with this part of the plan. And it's a little bit harder to see the benefits. So some of the language in here is a little bit more like, well, we did everything else, and this is sort of the last little thing we can do. So.
Now, the other thing that I think is missing from here is anything about water conservation. I don't recall seeing anything in here about water conservation, which is there's adaptation, there's climate change issues, there's emissions issues with the use of water. So I think we need to have a section in here addressing water conservation and
I think that falls under resiliency, because it's usually
Yeah.
in response to drought and lack of water. So.
Does anyone have any specific, no specific actions came out of our discussions on water conservation, given that we defer to East Bay Mud, which is why we had that graphic earlier that was sort of like, here's the responsibility of the other agencies. So let us know if anyone has any specific actions they think might be relevant for the city to take on that beyond just outreach, which we already do, and municipal facilities, which we already do.
I was also curious why we didn't specifically mention cool roofing or alternative pavement materials. I know we talked about that a lot previously.
what did you say?
Cool roofing and pavement materials.
I had a pretty in-depth discussion with our Public Works Department about what is and is not feasible in Albany. And their take on cool roofing is that, you know, if a private home wants to do it, that's great. They would go about doing it their own way. On the municipal side, all of our roofs are a specific type of material that if we painted them, it would just chip off immediately. It's like metal. And there's also a bunch of equipment up there that we can't really move around to accommodate paint or plants. And then also like painting sidewalks and stuff, there's still a lot of research being done into it, and so they didn't want to commit to it yet until we knew if it was actually effective before we dump all this paint onto our streets and then have to maintain that and then find out that it's maybe not really effective.
That's not what this is about. It's not about painting the sidewalk. It's looking at the materials that are in the sidewalk and the reflectivity of it. So, and cool roofs are ubiquitous in commercial roofs. It's not a question of painting your brown shingle roof. It's an actual type of roof. So that that's a white roof that reflects the sun back out. So I don't know who is talking to you about that, but it's that cool roof is a common standard in building standards. So, and there's different materials you can use in roadways and sidewalks that have more reflectivity rather than, like a black asphalt. There's lighter colors that can be used. So the whole idea is to move away from, dark colors.
Any other committee comments related to this strategy section?
Well, I think
yeah.
the thing with the water, I mean, there could be targets in terms of water efficiency targets for in the building code and in the city's municipal buildings, and encouraging different strategies for homeowners to use more gray water. Those kind of strategies. I mean, this is something we've been talking about for a long time, about how we're not connected to the gray water system. So things like that could have a huge impact on the city's water use. If we're able to use connect to the gray water system, if they can complete that section, I believe is in Berkeley or something, so that we can get gray water to commercial and residential properties.
Any other last comments? And so we once again have opportunity for public comment if you'd like to come ahead to the mic. And again, 2 minutes, please.
Hi, once again, I'm Jean Wu, and I actually have a solar and energy storage company. And we have looked very closely at trying to pair and work with the school system, because I think this is an opportunity to work with the school system to develop microgrids. If you had actual microgrids, even if you increase electrification, which you want to do, then you're going to increase the power usage from the grid, and when the grid goes down, everything goes down. But if you have microgrids standing in different parts of the town, they can actually power large areas and neighborhoods. Generally speaking, when we build something, we actually encourage people to overbuild, because we know when the grid goes down, it will support the neighborhood. That's one. I think also you could do the same thing with city buildings. And I think the other thing that you completely forgot is the fires. With air pollution, what it was for several days, many people suffered. Many people with asthma suffered, and many people who didn't have asthma before probably have asthma now. And you probably should be looking at how you can help mitigate the air pollution issues, help people get the right kind of masks, help people get funding for HEPA filters, understand how that works, put in the right kind of air filtration systems. If they're going to change their furnaces, get an air filtration system that will help take care of the particles, because that will shorten their lives by 10 to 15 years.
So,
Thank you.
Can I respond to that super quickly? If you look at 4.1, we have a little parenthetical. Popular community gathering spaces must be made safe during air quality emergencies, smog, or wildfire smoke. So we didn't forget it entirely, but I agree that it, especially like if you're looking for an N95 air mask during a wildfire emergency for your kid who has asthma and the drugstore is completely out, there's not much you can do, and I think the city can help with that.
Hi, my name is Brian Martin, and I had a few comments. One was I'm on the Parks and Recreation Committee, and I noticed the item you guys were talking about earlier about the street tree master plan, and that's something that's also on Parks and Rec's work plan that was added this year. So that item is a high priority item, support and provide input into a city master tree plan. So do make sure you're coordinating with Shelley over there with Parks and Rec. And then as taking that hat off, and as resident on the west side, I echo that concern that there's not many city facilities over there that could be cooling centers or anything like that. The closest thing to us is where we are, it would be the Albany Bowl bowling alley. And they're air conditioned, but they have a no loitering policy. So that would be something that the city could look into, how to coordinate with local businesses as well. For the HEPA filters that were mentioned, for smoke events, there was something the state was considering, and I don't know if it passed, to provide funding for public buildings to get air filtration systems that would help with that. So that'd be something to look into, is to see if that's actually made it through the sausage factory in Sacramento. Also, something to consider previously on electrification, and for many of the things you guys are considering is accessory dwelling units. We're looking at potentially putting one in our backyard, and so you may not think there's a lot of new home construction in Albany, but actually when you look at the planning and commission, it's not commission, but the community development office, and you see what plans have been approved. A lot of them are for backyard cottages, and so there's people trying to build from scratch. And people like me would like input on how to go all electric, which isn't there right now.
Thank you.
Hi, Ian McLeod again. Just to get back to kind of the big idea here of resiliency, in terms of how we're building, for me, the main idea is all electric buildings with renewable resources, photovoltaics on the roof, and battery backup. And then Jean is entirely right. It will eventually be connected to a microgrid, which will have freestanding little microgrids sharing power all over the city. That's one of your long-term goals. I think microgrid development should be in your your plan. It may be a very long-term plan before it's integrated into how we do things, but that is the key to resiliency in terms of power. The battery systems are pretty expensive right now, but they're getting more and more sophisticated. They're able to not just store power and be a backup during emergencies, they're also able to provide power at night. So they do dual functions now, so that a single building is not pulling power from the grid at all, or very little, and then can be fully functional during an emergency. So in terms of resiliency, that's super important. There are so many great ideas in this section that it's hard to comment on all of them, because I could comment on each one at length. The other key going forward is building standards. You build tight buildings that have ventilation systems within them that are HEPA filtered. We did a passive house in Berkeley. I went in my client's house during the fires. It smelled great in there. There was no smoke. There was no particulate matter in this house. And that's part of how you build, which is something that we could be doing going forward. I'll have more to say later on passive house building standards. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think on the street tree plan and measure, there could be maybe a little broader view, and I know there was a mention of a green infrastructure plan capitalized, which in this document seemed to refer to it almost as though it's something that exists, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think the city has a green infrastructure plan currently.
In the process of developing a green stormwater infrastructure plan.
Okay. So I think a tree plan could be integrated with a green infrastructure plan. In particular, if you think of instances where there's a curb length that's about a space and a half long, well, the pavement could be taken up and you could put in a much bigger street tree in that half space rather than just leaving it pavement. As far as the volunteer tree inventory brigade, I think Albany Strollers and Rollers would probably be interested in doing that. Strollers and Rollers inventoried the sidewalks on all 600 blocks of the city about 10 years ago, and that led to the sidewalk measure, and this seems like something that would be right up in its wheelhouse. Obviously, I can't speak for the organization, but that would be my guess, because there is a strong nexus between the presence of street trees and people's choice to actually get around by foot. And a lot of streets don't have much of a landscape width for street trees. So another idea is to actually mandate that the city over time move its sidewalks to the edge of its public property, the edge of the property that it owns, which is not where the edge of the sidewalk is currently, to open up more space for street trees. There's also a lot of species that have been allowed that, you know, in my part of Albany, which is kind of between BART and San Pablo, there's a lot of species that just don't cut it. You know, they're just like, they look like little Grinch trees. There's other species that in the same space have made 100% canopy. So if you think of the west side of Masonic, south of Dartmouth, or south of Marin, it's the same size as all the other trees, but those trees are just, you know, total shade there. Same with Spokane, towards the north end, or just south of Brighton. So there are some species that can do a really great job in a small space, and we don't seem to be mandating those. Thanks.
Thank you. Are there any last closing comments on this plan, or I think this concludes that, and then we can move on to our next
You mean
one.
on the whole thing or just this section?
The whole thing.
Yeah, so on the wrap-up, the kind of now what, one thing what you can do in the appendix, I thought this is a great section, and this is really where we can engage a lot of residents and get people doing stuff. And I thought just before leaping into these specific strategies, it'd be nice to have a section just called Get Informed and Involved. And that would have 2 bullets. One would be like join a local neighborhood group promoting climate action, such as ACAC, so we can kind of plug. And we could add other groups too. I mean, Strollers and Rollers, another group. And then sign up using Carbon-Free Albany. Rather than burying it in the resiliency section, I think I would bring it out as a way for people to get involved. I think we need to highlight that one more. I know they had a little blurb page just on climate-free Albany, but if you read it, it sounds like, yay, it's this great success and everybody's using it, and really we only have 59 people or homes, and we need to get it more where we tell people this is what you do. On that line, I'd like to see that section sort of modified a bit that gave people little pointers of actually some instruction set. I've talked to several people where they got really frustrated trying to sign up, especially when they tried to link their PG&E information. And we should have the simple way where you just forget about that and you just put in the generic information on your home. And if we guide people to that, I think we would get a lot more people sort of joining up. Anyway.
One thing in what you can do under transitional low carbon transportation, I'm not sure why the second bullet calls for an electric bike. It says use an electric bike for, I mean, why not use a bike or walk?
But also the first one that says drive alone.
Yeah.
I think that's what you're
Yeah. This is avoid single passenger car trips is what that should say. Drive alone is one day. Anyway, there's some English stuff there.
Any other large-scale comments other than the nitpicky stuff like that? Okay.
I just think to reiterate that there should be some targets in here and much more specificity of by such and such a date, this is what we're going to do. Otherwise, it just lets the city off the hook because, hey, we don't have to do anything for 20 years. Why would we start now?
I guess another way of thinking about, I was thinking similarly, Tom, another way of thinking about this is, as we were tracking the city's emissions over time since like 2011, what would we have liked to have seen? Because it is very kind of, it's like a top line number, but then we get a breakout. Sometimes we don't even get a very good break. The PG&E doesn't even provide the full breakout. But, for future tracking, we may not be here, but for the next members, what would be useful, helpful, kind of targets setting, for, to track against, right?
And in the upfront sections where it talks about, like where we are and where we need to be, I was looking at the City of Portland Climate Action Plan. They have a lot more detail about like the impacts of the different measures and what individuals can do versus what cities can do, and it's a little bit more explanatory about it. It gives a little bit better picture, I think, of the like where we are and where we can get to, and in the bigger picture. And again, I think as far as selling it to the average citizen, having that feeling of like, oh, here's what I'm doing and here's the impact I'm making. And they didn't, I know people have pointed that one as a good one, so I went and read it, and they do have some really nice graphics that are really easy to interpret as just so I'd like to see more of that, but not get overboard on, that it's all preamble and no meat at the end, so.
One other way of thinking about this potentially is like, what is the number of zero emission vehicles which are required by 2030 and 2040, coupled with the rate or the adoption, like the percentage of homes which are electrified by similar dates in order to meet the said targets. That type of thing could be very informative. Of course, that's going to be a dynamic thing. It could change over time. But the reason I didn't bring that up is actually because I wasn't sure if the consultant was scoped to do that, because I think that would require just a little bit more in the way of modeling and computational, a lot of assumptions and so forth.
Well, just to address all those comments, on page 7 at the top it says implementation. In the final version of the plan, an implementation plan will be included. Each strategy will come with detailed actions, a responsible entity, and key partners to lead them, and a time frame for implementation. An implementation matrix will also be included with key performance indicators, funding strategies, and other key factors necessary for successful implementation. My comment was on most important part of the effort. Is any of this in the draft form? Are they providing this?
we're developing that plan once we have a sense of what the actions are, right? So it takes a lot of time to dive into those details, and once we have a sense of what the actions are, we will do that and bring it to you.
Right. So, and the consultants involved with that, right? I mean,
Yes.
yeah, okay. So I think the answer is, yeah, we're going to, and Tom, I'm hoping you look at this closely too. I mean, we're supposed to get this stuff.
So the reason that we've done it, and I apologize, I'm repeating myself, but the reason that we have structured it this way is because other cities who've done CAP 2.0s have been really successful in a way that CAP 1.0s were not, is that if you have an implementation plan, it can be flexible. It doesn't necessarily have to go to council. It can be flexible in terms of, hey, there's this new technology, we're going to shift our focus, or hey, there's this huge barrier we didn't anticipate, we're going to shift our focus. So the CAP is sort of this, I understand your desire to have some teeth in it, and we can try to, find some sort of balance where it does, but we want to make sure there's some flexibility in the implementation plan as things change, so that we're not just throwing it out because it's not relevant anymore, which is kind of how it felt with the first CAP a little bit.
Yeah, and on this same page, what does success look like? This was a little too like world peace, or I mean, I know this is what we're, hopefully everything's going for, but I think, to reiterate what Max says, there should be, success would look like hitting certain milestones at certain times, and we should identify what those are. I mean, just to say success is seen through the widespread elimination of fossil fuel use, improved quality of life, and global climate stabilization that ensures a sustainable, resilient city for current and future generations. I mean, that's like, yay, and we all live happily ever after. I mean, I think we need more definition than that. If that's what success looks, I mean, that's way out there and may never happen. But I think for what we're planning for, we should have milestones, and we should know what those milestones are.
We have one more opportunity for public comment before we close up this item.
Yeah, so I was just going to suggest maybe beefing up the introduction. It seems to take the approach that climate change isn't happening yet. And one of the graphs that really caught my eye was the number of days per year that's over 90 degrees, and it starts at 0. Well, we know it isn't 0. We just experienced it not being 0. I downloaded the Berkeley Weather Station daily temperature maximum back to 1893, so we're fortunate to live near a weather station with that length of record. And up until about 1990, the average is about 2 days a year, and over the last 10 years, it's been about 6 days a year. So I think the plan would be more impactful to people that actually read it if it said, we're in it now. Yes, we are succeeding. We have reduced our emissions to the target, although that's another question. I'm sort of amazed we've done that. I mean, it said we'd reduce 27% without Brilliant 100, which I don't know how that happened, so I'd love to see the numbers on that, and hopefully that'll be in an appendix. But I think we should be telling the other side too, which is, we're in trouble and we need to do more, because when people come back and question the hard choices that can be made, it's going to be useful to have an introduction that really lays it out for real where we're at right now, not just this is something that's coming down the line. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, so yeah.
Well, I just want to reinforce what he's saying. This is really, really important work for the city. And this should be, in a lot of ways, the foundational document for how the city makes decisions and how we do things going forward. I think everything really should be filtered through this kind of document. So when you're saying, let's put something in here and it can be referenced by other city bodies later, I think that's really important. So don't underestimate how much of an impact that kind of thing can have. So I really appreciate your work. I think it's super important. I think we are in a severe crisis. I don't think there's any way to sugarcoat it. The status quo is not acceptable, and we need to start doing things differently. And this is the document that will help us get there. So thank you very much for your work. I'm really, really impressed and proud of how much time and effort you're putting into it. So thank you, and thank you, staff, too. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so now concluding that item and moving to 6.3, update from the Green Building Subcommittee.
That'd be easy. Casey.
We didn't meet, but we should.
Oh,
Well, I had some thoughts on that, but do you want to?
No, I don't want to spend the time at this hour going into the details. I have been researching the issue and trying to follow what other cities are doing, and I'd like to share that with the subcommittee.
Good.
And I think it's important to share it with you before you have jump to any conclusions about what we should do next. So, when the three of you are available, just, let me, or I'll send out another email maybe with a doodle poll or something, and we can try to get together.
Yeah, we should agree on a date, and I'm gone all of July, so if we could do it soon. The other thing is I think we want to keep this up, and there is strong, I've gotten a lot of information, people have strong interest in Albany being not just a follower, but also one of the leaders, along with we realize we don't want to be on the bleeding edge, but we really want to move this along. So there's a lot of interest in it. And if we can keep it on the agenda, and look forward to hearing what you have to report.
are there any public comments on this item?
I could give a little bit. So, or Jeff, you can. I mean, you gave a talk about how easy it would be to actually do a reach code to eliminate new gas hookup.
I don't remember saying easy.
Well, no, the
challenges.
challenges. And so we made a subcommittee to review and see and advise, advise City Council on what should happen. I mean,
there's a lot of discussion going on throughout the country and particularly in the Bay Area about different ways of adopting reach codes. There are very good reasons to do it. There's not very many people who've actually figured out how to do it without exposing municipalities to legal challenge. And it's a very complicated part of state and federal law. But I've done as much research as I can on it, and I'd like to share that with the subcommittee, and then bring it, following that discussion, bring it to the full committee, and then so on and so forth.
So that was specifically about the gas, eliminating natural gas.
Well, that's maybe the primary, but there's also alternatives of adopting tier, California Green Building Code tiers, and whether or not to incorporate into our planning code some design standards that have the effect of reducing greenhouse gas generation.
Okay, if I may, I just have been learning a little bit more about multifamily homes and the passive house standard, which is a very energy efficient standard. And Passive House California has been doing reach code analysis, reach code research, and presenting their findings to the California Energy Commission for potential adoption. And it looks like it would be approved by the state of California as a reach code. For those who don't know, it's a very tightly sealed, highly insulated building envelope, very energy efficient, very comfortable to live in. It has 24/7 mechanical ventilation, which is filtered, HEPA filtered, so that's where you get the good air quality. And I was talking to some people recently, and they are really pushing Passive House for multifamily dwellings, and they're finding that they can achieve Passive House standards at the same cost as conventional construction. And the benefits you get when you insulate and air seal is that you can downsize your equipment sizes, so you're saving money there. You combine it with electrification, so you're not doing gas, you're not producing greenhouse gases. So I would really encourage you to look into this as a reach code that we could adopt here in Albany, and would have specific application to new housing developments, and specifically the one that's coming up in the fall. So the bottom line is you can do it, you get a better result for about the same amount of money invested into the housing development project. So Yes.
Oh, just a clarification. So the reason that you're highlighting multifamily as opposed to single family is because it is more affordable in multifamily? Or
From
could the
what I've
statement be applicable to a
learned-
single family as well?
From what I've learned is that it is more of, the cost, it breaks even on a multifamily development. Single-family homes, there's more upfront cost. It's hard for me to say that it costs more because you're saving a lot of money over time because you're downsizing your equipment. But in general, this is what I'm just been learning from Passive House California, is that it really, really works for multifamily projects. And that's where they find that their program can have the biggest impact as well. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so now for future agenda items, I believe what I've heard is a discussion on the timeline for the climate action plan overall. Oh, sorry.
Sorry. Ian. Hey, Ian, sorry. Can I talk to you afterwards? Just for 1 minute? 1 minute.
Actually, 1 minute. And then the next being this update from the Green Building Subcommittee. So then that can conclude our meeting.
Are there any development projects in the city going on?
The main one that I think I mentioned at the last meeting is the satellite affordable housing project at Washington and Cleveland. There will be another community meeting probably sometime later in July. Date hasn't been set yet. They're doing some design changes and research based on the feedback they got from the first meeting.
But is that something that we could review? Could you do a presentation about what the sustainability of the design?
Eventually. But it's not at any level that we know any of the details. They have expressed support for the idea of doing an all-electric building, that they're not at that level of design where we can point to exactly what they're doing, but they have heard that from us, and they seem to be very enthusiastic about doing it.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think we're all done for tonight.
And,
Yeah, meeting adjourned. That's the word.
could you have me listed as
I just
Tom
came back
Cooper?
from a 4-day camping trip, and I've been disconnected from the internet, and I got home 10 minutes before I had to be here, and so I'm just like.